Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. This is another week of Turning Towards Life with Lizzie and Justin from Thirdspace. It's Sunday morning here in London, and we are live for the thing that we've been doing week in, week out for hundreds of weeks now, which is embarking on a conversation together, which will be sparked by a wonderful source, Lizzie, that you've brought for us this week, and then we'll see how it goes for the next half an hour. Always something magical arrives from our talking to one another. So I want to say welcome to all of you who are with us, some of you who are with us live in our Facebook group, which everyone is welcome to join. Just search for Turning Towards Life. Or you may, as many people do, be watching on our website, which is turningtowards.life later, or on Instagram, or on a podcast, all the different ways that you can find us either live or later. And it's such a joy and a privilege to be accompanying and to be accompanied by so many people. And a couple of other things just to say before we begin. One is just a reminder that you're so welcome to tell other people about this conversation and all the other conversations if you find them life-giving. We know that, Lizzie, so much has happened from people sharing this with other people in their lives. But the other thing to say is you can now contact us. So if you're not part of the Facebook group and you want to in some way be in touch with us, you can send us an email now at hello@turningtowards.life. That's hello@turningtowards.life, and we will be so glad to hear from you.
Thank you, Justin. It's always a lovely thing for us just to say hello like we do. I was just thinking, my goodness, we're in a kind of, it feels like this is an invitation to a kind of a perpetual feeling of appreciation for being here. Like I notice when we get into the room, as it were, something arises in me just that I'm really grateful that we do this, and it doesn't fail to arrive each week. You know, whatever kind of kerfuffle I'm coming from, it's just really lovely always to be here on a Sunday morning with you. And some people have said to me, my goodness, every Sunday morning, is that not like really disruptive? And how do you, but it seems to me to be the kind of the piece where it really works, because nothing's really, I'm not one of those people who kind of springs up in the morning and, you know, does something heroic. It's like our day starts slowly. And so this feels like a little gem of a space to be in together, and I really appreciate the timing of it, and that it's Sunday. It just feels like a really beautiful spot in my week, so thank you. So this source today is a poem by Craig O'Flaherty, who is a colleague of ours, Justin, and it feels to me like a beautiful possibility that we might get into today. And so I want to thank Craig for writing it. He writes many poems, and this one was one that he shared with us in a process we were in together, and it just feels like a very beautiful invitation. So here goes. I'm going to read. This is Homecoming by Craig O'Flaherty. Aloneness is a journey within, as we seek to unlock doors we've closed behind us. It's only through each other that our hesitant seeds might break through a baked red earth. And might we become the weavers of that circle that could bind us?
So I'm going to read it as well. And before I read it, I haven't said this for a long time with our reading, Lizzie, but for all of us who are listening, you might want to take a moment just to gather yourself and settle yourself, and maybe if you're in the middle of something, just for a moment interrupt it so that Craig's words can land in the way that they can. You might want to take a breath or find your feet or just pause for a moment. And if you do ever want to read the sources that we're reading either along with us or later, they're always on our Facebook group, but they're always on turningtowards.life. All 190 something are there for you to read. And this is Homecoming. Aloneness is a journey within, as we seek to unlock doors we've closed behind us. It's only through each other that our hesitant seeds might break through a baked red earth. How might we become the weavers of that circle that could bind us?
So what arises for me so strongly when you read that, Justin, and as I was reading too, is, you know, when there are times when I've withdrawn from something, like a friendship or a conversation or a dynamic of some kind. This poem for me speaks to how hard it is to re-enter. You know, so I know for myself the kind of vulnerability of coming back in the room, as it were, how kind of excruciating it is once I've, you know, I've made the fanfare of leaving, I've taken myself away with what I perceive as good reason or whatever. And then for me, this poem speaks of, I actually want to be back in that room. And it's really vulnerable to admit I want to be back in the room. And so I have to do these first two things, which is find a way to do my own inner journey, the journey within, to find some more solid ground in me that isn't only buffeted around by whatever happened that made me leave, that had me be the one outside, but something more than that. And that requires some kind of inner honesty and inner journeying to find out what's beneath and what happened really, and all that stuff. Because I was the one that took myself out and I locked the door. And yes, there might be a lot of things that had me leave, but really, I took myself out. And then I have to recognize that my little seeds are hesitant and the wall I built is quite baked, and that I need people to kind of help me back in again. And I mean, as I say, it all feels so vulnerable. It feels so vulnerable to put myself back in the mix from which I removed myself. And then the invitation at the end that Craig makes is, how might we become the weavers of that circle that could bind us? I.e., how do we be people where if someone does step away, how do we be the each other that enables somebody to break through with their hesitant seeds through that baked earth, and leave it not only up to the person, i.e. me, to make their way back in again, but see what we can do to make invitations to come back in again too, to make it a little bit maybe less vulnerable, so that I'm not the only one trying to make my way back in, but there's someone maybe ushering me back in too. And of course that's difficult when there's just two of you, like in a marriage or something, and you've got to walk back in the door after you've really gone to town on something and made a big deal of something, maybe quite rightly. Like it's not to say that I feel like any time I've done this I've been wrong or something, but this kind of withdrawal and then re-entry feels like such a tender place. Like there's so much shame in it and so much kind of embarrassment, because in a way it's kind of the reason I left, the reason I took myself out, has often lessened, and I can see much more with a little bit of space and a little bit of time. And to come back in again kind of highlights that the part of me that was really reactive then, and that I advocated for and that I made a big deal about and all the things, isn't as big as I made it out to be, because of something bigger here, which is why I want to come back. So I can feel the shame of it and the embarrassment of it and the maybe I made too much of it, maybe I didn't handle it very skillfully, maybe I overreacted, you know, all of those things. And so to kind of come back in, I feel like you know, this is what my body feels like, a kind of small, humble, my shoulders are up a bit, my face is down, and you know, I can't really look you in the eyes, like I'm back again, would you still have me, kind of feeling. And of course it's what I really want, and it's so vulnerable.
It's such an excellent way of talking about this poem, Lizzie, and so different to what had come up in me
Yeah.
from it. um, and I've also been with you a couple of times when you've been the one who's got up and left a group and then come back. And one of the, so I so admire you for that, because one of the things, I suppose one of the reasons why this poem showed up so differently for me is that the move that I've learned to make is when I walk out on something, has often been to walk out internally, not actually walk out.
Right.
Right. So as to been to disappear inside. Like, I don't want to be here, but I'm not going to be necessarily brave enough to go, right, I'm out of here because of this, or I'm just out of here. Now I don't think I've ever done that in a group. I have done that in closer, more intimate relationships. Like, I'm going out the door now, I'm not staying here. And the same dynamic is, I can really feel this. You're spot on also with my experience about both the sense of the sort of, I'm walking out sometimes for good reason and sometimes for not good reason. And nearly always I want to come back. So I'm really with you, and it's a really difficult, it's a really tender spot to be in. But the reason I said all of that is, I really wanted to honor that in the times that I've been in, a couple of times I've been in situations with you where you've said whatever it is you've said, and it's like, enough, I'm out of here, and you've gone out, is also that I recognize that very often, no, actually always, when I've seen you do that, there's truth in your leaving. You know, the closing, there's sometimes the closing the doors behind us. This line that Craig says about, we seek to unlock the doors we close behind. Sometimes we close the doors behind us for good reason. Like, right in that moment is the right thing to do, or it feels like the dignified thing to do, or the truthful thing to do.
Yeah.
So I want to honor all of that about you. And the thing that you're speaking then got me onto, which is, I think is true regardless of whether we're people who have a way of getting up and leaving the room, or that I might have more to say about this as we go on, or disappearing inside, which is less demonstrative and probably not as skillful in some ways as just getting up and walking out when it's time to walk out. When we want to return with all of the shame and the vulnerability and everything about it, the part that I've got most interested in, as you were speaking about, is, and you pointed to this, is the how might we become the weavers of the circle that could bind us. But this is the way that it was occurring to me is, if you and I are in a disagreement and one of us says, enough, I'm not staying, I can't stay in contact with this or with you at this moment, I'm withdrawing. What is it that makes it possible for us to welcome one another back without demanding, Lizzie, you can only come back into this environment as long as you set aside the thing that you said or did that had you leave, that was troubling or troublesome or different, or had you stand out, as well as you sort of recognizing that you, as the person who has literally got up and left and closed the door behind you, may really long to be back in relationship, and maybe entering with shame and all of that going on. And I welcome you. Can I not use this as an opportunity to have you back in relationship simply on my terms? Right now you've closed the door, I'll only accept you back as long as you set all that aside. But actually to welcome you back with all of your difference from me and all of our disagreement still allowed to have its place. And I think it's so excellent that it's in this poem of Craig's, because it's inevitable, if we're truthful with one another, that we'll get flung apart at times. Like we can't have the condition of our relationships be that we just agree with one another, or we see the world in the same way, or we just sort of get along in some easy sense.
Yeah.
So there's also a kind of vulnerability and tenderness and shame on the side of the person who's willing to go, please, let's be back in relationship, and I'll set aside my demand that you just fit in with my way. Like there's just a ton of the circle back to being in honest, dignified, contactful, truthful relationship with one another when there's some kind of closing a door behind us is a really tender, vulnerable place for everyone.
Yeah.
And what does it take to be that for one another?
Yeah, that's really beautiful, Justin, that so either side of the dynamic becomes more possible depending on what the other side is doing. So as in, if I've walked away from you, you're welcoming me back has a big impact on whether I can walk back in again. And that feels really, really important, that we can be that for each other. And also, when you were speaking, what came to me is like all the ways that I relate to people, so this never has to be considered. Like I can find a place in me that relates in a particular way, but I would never have to face this kind of this vulnerability. So I can see the part of me that doesn't tell the truth because it might mean this would have to happen. So I kind of hedge and have a certain, so I think it came when you said, it doesn't necessarily go and probably never goes, that we all just get along fine. So this is really the territory, is a series of homecomings and withdrawals and coming back again, and the kind of breathing in and breathing out in our relationships. But there's a way that I can see I live, and I wouldn't say wholly live, but I know I'm up to this in certain places in my life where I just keep things at a certain level because I don't want to have to consider this. And that might be I stay withdrawn completely because I don't want to have to re-enter, or just generally in the relationship, I never want to have to leave and come back. So I just stay in a kind of surface way and don't really say what I think, or I don't want to rock the boat, basically. And I'm just making this connection of one of the reasons why I don't want to rock the boat, because of this tender territory. It's like, it's really hardcore, this coming back in the room again. And if this is happening, I know how this feels. Like I've had to come back in the room like many, many times in my life. And it's cringeful and takes loads of strength and commitment to truth and commitment, as you said, to whoever someone is being, not what I think they should be being. To forgive and come back in again is to see things in a whole new light, rather than to deal with even some things aren't dealable, withable, they're not solvable. Lots of things aren't. So to come back in forgiveness, as you say, means a kind of unconditionality in that moment where I'm not saying it has to be a certain way and I'm still coming back in. I mean, even as I say it, there's such a kind of, whoa, is that even possible? And I know it is. And actually, most times in my life when I've done it, I've had a welcome that I hadn't imagined. I hadn't been able to imagine from the place I was in, from having withdrawn, because the story told me that it wasn't possible to come home again. And so then when I don't believe the story so much and I find somewhere more significant than the story, which is why we're together in the first place, why we're connected in the first place, or something like that, like the essential nature of our connection. And I find that in me, something else arises that enables me to walk back in. But sometimes it's really tiny, you know, sometimes it's like a little dangly thread that I'm just kind of hanging on to desperately, when most of the picture is the story. And I have to find that thread of connection, or find that thread of essence between us to hang on to get me back through the door again. And then of course that kind of has the possibility of growing again. But this is really hard. And I love Craig's language as well, like hesitancy and bakedness, you know, that it's so evocative of those delicate places in us that have to do. It's reminding me, you know, when you see like a piece of concrete and there's a flower growing out of it, it's like that. It's like the little teensy flower has made its way through the little gaps in the concrete to kind of find the light, to find the sunshine, to help it grow. And it had to make its way through concrete to do that. It feels like that kind of order of strength and vulnerability and wish and hopefulness.
Moving hearing you talk about this, and I can feel, Lizzie, in me, the parts of me that would go, never let this happen, never let this rupture and return happen.
Yeah.
It's unsafe. And you know, and I suppose that all of us have. It's certainly true that I have in my own immediate experience and in the generations of my family as well before, which I'm sure informed me in this. There are cases where the rupture wasn't repairable and that there were consequences to it. You know, that sometimes when we say enough in whatever way, whether it's by withdrawing inside or getting up and walking out of the door, or saying to someone, I don't want to be in this conversation with you now, of course it's risky. That's why we avoid doing it. But the consequence of it is when you talked about truth earlier, that could really feel that in my own body, is that the consequence of saying safe can often be that what we do is we become untruthful, or we lose contact with our own dignity. So in order to stay safe in this relational field, I won't speak up because there's a risk of rupture. And again, it's the call in Craig's poem, which is so powerful to me, is how about we instead said, of course there'll be rupture. Of course there will be times when, in order to protect myself, in order to stand for something, or simply because right now what's going on in me is I can't, it's too much, I'm going to withdraw, even if for a while. Can we allow for that? Can we allow one another that? Because I think that part of also what's going on is, and I know that this is true, for example, with you, is that if you withdraw, I really trust that we'll find a way back. Like I'm prepared to trust in something much deeper than the immediate experience of difference or disagreement or whatever. And that's been really hard for me to learn, actually, because for me, very often that moment of the moment of withdrawal of relationship is so tender and so painful. It's really, really hard to stay with. But if we can live into Craig's invitation and ask ourselves the question, how, when there are ruptures between us because we inevitably stand in different places or see different things, or because we hurt one another through what we say or what we do or what we don't do, what happens when we all stand as weavers of the circles that could bind us? Not from the position of, you'll agree with me, and not from the position of, and forgiveness, that there was a word that you used, is such a useful word here, because I think that forgiveness doesn't mean, oh, I'll just set aside everything I think and feel here. I think forgiveness means I'll give up trying to have you be different, and I'll see you as the full human that you are not as some object of my fulfilling my needs and not as some object of fitting in with my preferences, but instead I'll forgive myself for wanting for you to be different, which is probably the first step. And maybe I can just forgive myself that I wanted you to agree with me all the time. And I can forgive you for being different to how I imagined, which is no value judgment. It's simply you're another living expression of life. You're going to be different. And then trusting that there's something much bigger and deeper that we could weave together that would bind us. And I think that in doing that, what we do is when we can do it, and we can't always, sometimes relationships really do rupture, but I think we build something much more supple and robust and genuinely loving, in which there's much, much more space for our mutual truthfulness than we had before when we were trying never to have this happen. Just such a teeny weeny space.
Yeah. That's so interesting, Justin. As you were talking, like all these times. I mean, this morning I came to this, with the feeling of this, because I know it's happened. But as you've been speaking, I'm literally thinking of all of the actual times that this happened. It's all kind of returning to me, all the things. And so I'm kind of reviewing things that have happened as we're speaking, and just feeling how when this does happen, when there's a rupture, and then maybe we come back again, or find a new home, as you say, some things aren't fixable. It's a really big thing. I just am watching myself in retrospect of how it's felt and how hurt I felt and how much I like properly wailed at times when these ruptures have happened, like really deep kind of grief actually. And you were saying to me that you wanted to kind of honor the part of me that has a reason to go, and that's to be trusted. And I think that's really true. And that's kind of part of the dilemma, is because that part of me is justified and truthful. But even justification and truth isn't deep enough in a way. Like there's something deeper, which is this kind of belongingness and the purposefulness of being in relationship feels like a much deeper place that I need to be in contact with, so that my righteousness and that my position and that my truth finds its right size rather than being everything. Because if my truth is everything, there really isn't any room for your truth, that's for sure. Like if I'm in my righteous place of, well, I'm the one who has the most valid opinion, or I'm the one who is right here, it doesn't leave room for the thing to happen that you're saying. It doesn't leave room for us to come back together again. So it's almost like I can see that I must acknowledge and have to acknowledge the truthfulness of what I'm saying, but there's always an and. There's just always a wider perspective than mine. And I don't have to get that wide to see that. I don't have to extend my view too much to see that mine is just one, and that there are many probably that I could even hold, let alone another person, and then another person, and then another person. So, the group thing gets really complex because there's like trillions of perspectives in the space. And I'm just noticing that it's so important to have the capacity to find depth, to find something deeper than the righteousness I feel like I'm standing on, and to not throw the righteousness out, because it does have a point. Like I really truly believe that in a system, when something is making a lot of noise, we have to turn towards it and listen to it. And that's part of being the each other that become this circle that can bind us, is to turn towards the pain and turn towards the difficulty and welcome it, so that we can listen to it in service of the system knowing itself and learning. And I feel like everyone always has a point that's worth listening to and trusting. And I think that's when we get into the most trouble in these systems, is when we turn away from the difficulty and turn away from the pain. Because inherently it belongs in the system. It's trying to say something. So when you feel something inside of our relationship, which I'm calling a system, it's worthy of us turning towards, rather than you running away and me saying, yeah, bugger off, like, let's throw this. Like, there's an inherent intelligence to the system that's got made by us being together, whether it's you and I, or whether it's a family, or whether it's a group, that we can turn towards and just trust what is being brought to the light warrants our turning towards it. And we'll have untold gifts to bring us if we can be the people that you're suggesting we can be, which is that we can hold a perspective, be a certain way where I can let go of what I think things should be, who I think you should be, who I think I should be. I can feel as I'm speaking how extraordinary, miraculous it might be if we could almost kind of stand to the side of ourselves for a minute to have a conversation that's different to the tennis match we've been having for 10 years. What would that be like? And how could we relate in a different way that isn't just your personality rubbing up against mine, but there's something deeper and more possible arises if we can have the capacity to step aside from ourselves, even for a little time out of time, to go, well, what's possible from here when I'm not entrenched in that place? And that feels really possibility making.
Maybe that's the way that we get to become the weavers of the circle that could bind us, that Craig talks about. Because as you were talking about this, Lizzie, I was feeling into and reflecting on what it's like for me when I'm sure of my rightness and what happens from it. And there's a couple of things that I can see are really hard for me to do on my own, which is why it's only through one another that our hesitant seeds. So one thing that really easily happens for me when there's a rupture is I imagine the converse, which is I imagine that what I have to say has no bearing on the situation, that I am flatly wrong, and that because I'm flatly wrong, I'm about to get ejected and abandoned by you, by my family, by the system that I'm in. And I suppose that kind of the trauma of that has very deep roots in me. And so it's very easy for me either to collapse into nothingness and to disappear, or to make the counter move, which is to go, well, I'm going to just assert my rightness, because that will, if I really fight. And either way, I can feel, I know that in myself, the feeling of undignity in my own body is really pronounced. Like, even as I'm explaining this to you, I can feel how narrow and shallow and like squished both places are. But because there's so much fear in both of them, for me, the act of, which I so love your language, but what if we step beside ourselves? What if we let go of our own very particular position and start to see from a more global perspective in this system, a wider perspective? It really helps me to do that if someone else will invite me that way too. In other words, of course, I have a responsibility to, then I have a responsibility towards you that I do that. But it really helps me if you, the other, makes the move to say. So I'm actually wondering about what happens if right when we're in the heat of this, when we can feel all, it feels to me like being caught in, tectonic plates pushing and squeezing, when we're feeling squeezed and pulled and right and wrong, and all of that's going on, all of the energetic stuff is going on. That might be the moment that we could say, how might we become the weavers of the circle that could bind us? If we could ask that, if we could remember to ask that question of one another as well as of ourselves, right in the moment when it's most squeezy, most traumatic, most painful, most energized, most mobilized, that might give us a route. Craig's question might give us a route to do exactly the thing that is called for, that we wouldn't otherwise do, and which certainly is very hard for me to do on my own.
Yeah. My gosh, Justin, that's totally opening up this other place as well of, what if in whatever system we're in, whether it's our relationship, whether it's our family, bigger something, what if we had practices that answered this question all the time? So what if we were in answer to this question for the majority of our time, so that when the tectonic plate experience arrives, it arrives into the answer to this question. So we might have been practicing the binding, we might have been practicing the kind of the relational field creation, development, deepening as an ongoing practice, in view of the inevitability that you spoke about at the beginning, that we're not always going to get along. So what if we're continually, what's the word, like nourishing the foundational space of relationship in a system that is consciously created and worked with when everything's just fine. And so when it's not fine, which it won't be fine, because that's the nature of humanness, we have this kind of bed to return to of boundness, of we've been weaving as we've been going along in service of what will come inevitably, which is difficulty. I think that for me feels like such a beautiful invitation that we could all be attending to this, and to answer that question continually. How might we become the weavers of the circle that could bind us in our practices? Like, answer that question in the practices that we have. It provides such hope for when it all goes tectonic on us. That's so lovely. I'm noticing our time, Justin, and that's probably the place that we should end. And I feel so grateful for the nature of bringing these things and where it lands us up. It's miraculous to me every time. So thank you for the way that we are together, and that we understand what each other's saying and can find these little routes into different kinds of places. It's very beautiful to me. So thank you. And thank you to Craig again for enabling this conversation through this poem. How beautiful. And hopefully, Craig, if you're ever having a listen to this, we've I don't know, brought out some threads that are also interesting to you as well, and that are beneficial to you, and giving the dignity to this poem that it deserves, as in showing just how much reflection can happen from these words. It's very beautiful. So we'll be back next week as usual with another source, and just to say thank you everybody for being with us, and thank you, Justin, for this lovely conversation.
Thanks, Lizzie. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.